Hello all, today you will learn how to make your scene look hand-drawn with crayons in Blender with Eevee. It's using a combination of many techniques, so this tutorial will be more advanced. You'll need a black and white pencil texture, a gradient, and a paper texture. I got these off the internet, so feel free to screenshot. The first thing I'll do is set the resolution to 4:3 and lower the frame rate. This gives it more of an old school look. Now grab your object and give it a material. What we're going for is we want to show the pencil marks on the mesh, and everywhere else we want to see paper. To do this, we take advantage of transparency by overlaying the final render on top of the paper texture. So go to your film settings and check transparent. So we only want the crayon marks to be visible and everything else to be transparent. Add your pencil texture, plug it into a color ramp, then into a mix shader. The color ramp gives you control over how thick the lines are, and it's kind of optional. Now plug the ramp into the factor, then a diffuse BSDF into the first parameter, and add a holdout shader to use for the second. The holdout is essentially just transparency if you don't know. Now the color of your diffuse shader is the color of the lines. Now that is the basic texture setup, but I went a step further to make it fancy. The problem is that the pencil strokes will get smaller as the mesh moves away from the camera, which makes little sense if it's supposed to look hand-drawn. I have two solutions to this, one simple and one complex. The simple solution is to create a texture coordinate node, then plug the window into a mapping node, then into your texture. You can mess around with the scale and the rotation to make it look nice, and then you're finished. The downside to this is it gives you absolutely no control over how the crayon strokes look like across the mesh. This is why in my complex solution, we use the UV map instead. So we're going to scale the texture based on how far away it is, using some basic vector math. To be honest, the solution I have isn't very good, but maybe it fits your taste. To calculate the distance, create an object info node and plug the location into a vector transform node, set to point and world to camera. The length of this vector then gives us the distance between the object and the camera. We need the reciprocal of this number, so it becomes larger when the camera is closer, so divide it by 1. Then, plug it into a vector scale node along with the UV texture coordinates. And finally, into your mapping node. Keep in mind this is a crude solution, so if you know something better, let me know. The drum bear is going to use a texture instead of a plain color, and luckily that is very easy to do. Just copy and paste everything and use an image texture for the diffuse color. Also, if you're animating, it looks good to animate the X and Y of the mapping node. It works best with a lower frame rate. Now that's all for the texturing. If you render it as is, you will see that it's way too dark. We don't want to have any lighting in the scene, so go to the world settings and bump up the brightness. Also, you can turn off shadows and ray tracing in the render settings. Next, it's time to add the lines. I'm actually using two different sets of lines, the black lines that you can see, but also an invisible set of lines used to soften the edges of the mesh during compositing. First, we will do the invisible softening lines. Go to your render settings and check Freestyle, and use 1 pixel line thickness. Then go to the view layer settings and scroll down to Freestyle. You'll need to check the As Render Pass button and rename the line set to Blur. From here, you can mess with the settings however you'd like, or just copy mine. Just make sure the color is pure white. Here I'm animating the seed. This makes the lines jitter in animation, which sells the hand-drawn effect. Now before we add the black second set of lines, let's go to the compositor and throw together what we have so far. Check Use Nodes and bring in a View node so we can see what we're doing. The first order is we want to create a black and white mask that will tell us where we should see paper versus where we should see crayon marks. Let's grab the Freestyle pass and plug it into a glare node. This is what softens the edges. Set it to bloom with a mix of 1, threshold 0, and size 3. Then, I run the result through a multiply, which gives you more control over the falloff. I like the value 2. Finally, we subtract the alpha of the render from the multiply result. As you can see, this is how we introduce the crayon marks into the equation. This is why we used a holdout shader in the materials. Also make sure the subtract node is clamped. Now we're going to introduce our colors back into the render. Get a mix color node, and plug the subtract output into the factor, and the render image into the bottom image input. You can see it's starting to come together. Now let's add the paper background. Add in an image node, set it to your paper texture, and run it through a translate, then a scale node. Be sure wrap is set to both axes on the translate node. The scale node is just for your convenience. You might have to adjust it based on the dimensions of your scene and the dimensions of the image. Ideally, they would be the same though. Now just plug that into the top image input of the mix shader and we are almost done. I like to animate the X and Y of the translate to make it look like a flipbook. Now all that's missing is the black lines and a subtle gradient effect as the final touch. The thing with the black lines is we need them on a whole separate render pass, so we can't just add another line set. Instead, we're going to create a linked copy of our scene. If you've never seen this before, this is essentially another instantiation of your scene, similar to when you press Alt plus D on a mesh. If you make changes to the scene, you may have to redo this step. Since they look the same, you'll want to get into the habit of looking up here to make sure that you're editing the correct scene. Anyways, rename the scene to Draw Layer and go to the Freestyle settings. Be sure As Render Pass is checked again, and create a new line set, call it Draw, and make sure the old line set is unchecked. Again, you can do whatever you want here, or you can just copy my settings. And that's all there is to the black lines. Time to add them to the final render. Be sure you are in the main scene, then go back to the compositor. Add in a new render layers node, and set it to the draw layer. Run the freestyle pass through an alpha over node, with the output of the mix color node in the top image input. If nothing changes, you might have to render your scene again, and don't forget to plug in the composite node. Now we are almost done. The final touch is to fade out the edges of the image. Add your gradient texture and run it through a transform node. Again, you might need to mess with the scale depending on the resolution of your scene and texture. Then add a multiply, set to 4 and clamped. This controls the sharpness of the gradient. Now create one last mix color node, plug the multiply into the factor, the paper texture into the top image, and the alpha over into the bottom image. And there you have it. If you haven't seen it, you should click here to watch my animation I made using this setup. If you have any questions or criticisms, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, subscribe if you learned something, and thanks for watching.